My beloved child. Pause here, because the tears you thought would never fall have finally found their way into the light. For so long, they carried themselves as if nothing could reach them. They smiled when others were watching. They answered questions with calm words. They changed the subject whenever your name came too close to the truth. But in the quiet, when there was no one left to convince, something inside them broke open. And what happened in that hidden moment was not weakness. It was the first honest thing their heart had allowed them to feel in a very long time. Do not leave this story too quickly, because the tears were not only about losing you. They were about everything they refused to understand while you were still close enough to love them. They were about the words they swallowed, the chances they wasted, and the tenderness they mistook for something that would always remain available. One memory returned that night with such force that they could no longer hide behind silence. Yet that memory was only the beginning. The deepest reason they cried had been buried beneath pride, fear, and a truth they were not prepared to admit. You know what it is like to carry pain quietly. You know how it feels to wake up and continue functioning even when something inside you is tired of being strong. You have smiled for people who never noticed the weight behind your eyes. You have encouraged others while secretly wondering who would sit beside you when your own courage began to weaken. You have loved with patience, forgiven more than once, and questioned whether any of it mattered. There were moments when you wanted clarity, but received silence. There were moments when you needed reassurance, but were left to interpret distance. There were moments when you nearly blamed yourself for not being enough. Yet the truth within this fictional story is not that you lacked value. The truth is that someone may fail to recognize a precious thing while they are still standing close enough to touch it. Sometimes a heart does not understand what it held until absence removes the comfort of familiarity. Sometimes the silence after love becomes louder than every warning that came before it. That was what happened to them. At first, they believed they could move on without looking back. They told themselves the heaviness would pass. They filled their days with noise, conversations, responsibilities, and distractions. Whenever a memory appeared, they pushed it aside. Whenever regret tried to speak, they covered it with excuses. They said they had done what they needed to do. They said the distance was for the best. They said they were fine. And for a while, everyone believed them. Their friends saw the familiar smile. Their family heard the same steady voice. The people around them had no reason to suspect that your absence had changed the atmosphere of their inner world. They became skilled at appearing untouched. But night has a way of removing performances. When the doors were locked and the rooms became still, there was no audience left to impress. No one was there to laugh at the right moment or to accept another rehearsed answer. There was only silence, and silence began asking questions they could not escape. Why did your name still change their breathing? Why did ordinary places remind them of you? Why did they still remember the exact sound of your voice during the conversations they once pretended not to care about? Why did peace feel farther away after they had convinced themselves that leaving would make life easier? They tried not to answer. But the heart remembers what pride attempts to erase. One evening, rain began to fall against the window. It was not a violent storm. It was a slow, steady rain, the kind that makes a familiar room feel distant from the rest of the world. The lights were low. A phone rested on the table. The house was quiet enough for every small sound to become noticeable. They had been carrying an exhaustion they could not explain. Not the kind that sleep fixes, but the kind that settles into the soul when too many emotions remain unspoken. They reached for the phone without knowing why. Their thumb moved through old photographs, old messages, old moments they had avoided revisiting. At first, they told themselves it was only curiosity. They could stop whenever they wanted. Then they saw something connected to you. It was not dramatic. It was not a grand declaration or an extraordinary image. It was something simple. Something most people would have overlooked. Perhaps it was a sentence you once sent when they were having a difficult day. Perhaps it was a photograph from an ordinary moment. Perhaps it was a voice message they had forgotten to delete. But simplicity made it more powerful. Because suddenly they remembered the version of themselves that existed when your care was still near. They remembered being understood without having to explain every wound. They remembered how you noticed changes in their mood before anyone else did. They remembered how your presence softened days they had never admitted were difficult. And the first tear formed. They wiped it away quickly, almost angrily. It surprised them. They had not planned to feel anything. They had only planned to look for a few seconds, close the screen, and return to the safe numbness they had carefully built. But the heart had already stepped through a door their mind could not close. Another tear came. Then another. Soon they placed the phone face down because they could no longer bear to look at the memory. Yet turning the screen away did not remove what had awakened inside them. The silence was hiding something. For months, they had mistaken emotional numbness for healing. They thought that because they were no longer speaking about the loss no longer controlled them. They believed that avoidance meant strength. But that night, every emotion they had postponed arrived together. Regret. Longing. Guilt. Tenderness. Confusion. And beneath all of them, love that had never been honestly examined. They leaned forward, covering their face with trembling hands. Their breathing changed. The tears came faster than they could stop them. No one saw. No one knew. The person who had appeared so composed in daylight was quietly falling apart in a room where even the walls seemed to hold their breath. And still, this was not the deepest reason they cried. There was another truth beneath the grief. They were not only mourning the connection. They were mourning the person they had been when they failed to protect it. They remembered moments when you offered softness and they responded with distance. They remembered times when you asked for honesty and they gave you uncertainty. They remembered how often you tried to understand them while they remained hidden behind defenses you had not created. Perhaps they had been hurt before. Perhaps they had learned that vulnerability was dangerous. Perhaps they believed that caring deeply gave another person too much power. None of those fears made them evil. But fear can still cause damage when it is allowed to speak louder than love. They saw that now. The tears carried the weight of that realization. You had not asked them to be perfect. You had asked them to be present. You had not demanded every answer. You had asked for sincerity. You had not expected them to erase their wounds overnight. You had simply hoped they would stop making you pay for pain you did not cause. Yet they had confused your patience with permanence. They assumed there would always be another conversation, another apology, another chance to explain what they truly meant. Then your energy changed. Not suddenly, perhaps, but quietly. You stopped chasing explanations. You stopped begging for the bare minimum. You stopped trying to force understanding into a place where honesty had been repeatedly delayed. Your silence became different. It was no longer the silence of someone waiting to be chosen. It became the silence of someone beginning to choose themselves. They noticed. They may not have admitted it at the time, but they noticed. They felt the change in the way you responded. They sensed the distance in words that were still polite but no longer hopeful. They recognized that your heart was slowly closing a door it had once held open with both hands. And that frightened them more than any argument ever had. Conflict had always given them something to resist. Your pain had once allowed them to believe you were still emotionally present. Even disappointment meant you still cared enough to seek change. But calm distance carried another meaning. It meant you were learning how to live without the answer they refused to give. Your absence said what words could not. At first, they tried to dismiss it. They told themselves you would return to the old pattern. They waited for another message, another effort, another sign that you were still willing to carry the emotional weight for both of you. But the message did not come. The effort did not arrive. And each passing day forced them closer to a truth they had avoided: you were not punishing them. You were healing. That difference mattered. Revenge still looks backward. Healing begins to turn toward the future. They began to realize that you were not withdrawing to make them suffer. You were stepping away because remaining where you were repeatedly unseen had become too painful. That realization did not make them angry. It made them ashamed. Not the kind of shame that destroys a person, but the painful recognition that they had participated in losing something they once prayed to find. There had been a time when they wanted a love that felt safe. Then safety arrived through you. Yet because it did not resemble chaos, they did not know how to trust it. Because you were sincere. Because you cared, they wondered when you would change. Because you offered consistency, they mistook it for something ordinary. The wounded heart often recognizes instability more easily than peace. They had become familiar with disappointment. They knew how to protect themselves from betrayal. They knew how to survive emotional distance. But they did not know how to receive genuine care without questioning it. So they tested you. They pulled away to see whether you would follow. They became cold to measure how much warmth you would continue giving. They left things unsaid, believing that if you truly cared, you would somehow understand. And many times, you did. But understanding someone's wounds does not mean you must accept being wounded by them. That was the lesson they had refused to learn until the night the tears came. The rain continued against the glass. Their phone remained on the table. The room had grown darker, but they did not turn on another light. They sat with memories that no longer allowed them to hide. One moment returned more clearly than the others. It was a day when you had looked at them with an exhaustion you could no longer conceal. You had not raised your voice. You had not threatened to leave. You had simply asked a question. Did any of this matter to you? At the time, they avoided the answer. Perhaps they changed the subject. Perhaps they became defensive. Perhaps they gave you a few vague words because the honest response required more vulnerability than they were ready to show. But now, alone in the darkness, they answered the question. Yes. It mattered. It had always mattered. You mattered more than they had allowed themselves to say. The words escaped as a whisper. And something inside them collapsed. They cried harder. Not because they had suddenly discovered love, but because they finally admitted it after silence had already changed everything. One memory changed the meaning of the whole night. They remembered the last time you tried to reach them emotionally. You had not arrived with blame. You had arrived with tenderness. You had given them a chance to be truthful. You had left space for them to speak. But they had looked away from the opening because they assumed another one would appear later. Now they understood what they had missed. Not every door closes with a loud sound. Some close quietly after being held open for too long. This realization became the sharpest part of their grief. Yet do not misunderstand the message. Their tears were not a guarantee that they had changed completely. Emotion can reveal truth, but truth still requires courage. Regret can open a door, but responsibility must walk through it. Missing someone is not the same as becoming capable of loving them well. That distinction is important for you. Your compassionate heart may be tempted to turn someone else's pain into a reason to abandon your own boundaries. You may hear that they cried and immediately imagine that every wound can now be erased. But tears are a beginning, not proof of transformation. The spiritual meaning of this story is not that you must run back to what hurt you. It is that your love was not meaningless simply because another heart understood it late. Your kindness mattered. Your patience mattered. Your honesty mattered. Even the love you had to release taught something that possession never could. Still, there was more happening in that room. After the tears had slowed, they lifted the phone again. Their eyes were swollen. Their hands shook slightly. They opened the conversation they had avoided. Your name was still there. For a long moment, they did nothing. They read the last exchange. Then they scrolled upward. Message after message revealed a pattern they had once been too close to notice. Your words had been full of effort. You asked questions. You checked on them. You tried to understand. Even when you were hurting, you often softened your language because you did not want to make their pain heavier. They saw how many times you gave grace. They also saw how many times they answered your tenderness with delay. A message from you appeared on the screen. It was not dramatic. It did not accuse. It simply carried the quiet honesty of someone who was becoming tired. I don't need perfection. I just need to know I'm not alone in caring. They read it once. Then again. Then a third time. Their chest tightened. Because now they understood that you had never been asking for too much. You had been asking for reciprocity. You wanted to feel that the love you poured out was not disappearing into emptiness. You wanted to know that your emotional labor was being seen. You wanted partnership, not endless uncertainty. But they had heard your needs as pressure because responsibility frightened them. They had called your desire for clarity impatience. They had called your sensitivity overthinking. They had treated your emotional awareness as if it were a problem instead of recognizing it as the very quality that had allowed you to love them so carefully. That realization brought another wave of tears. This time, they did not wipe them away. They let them fall. For once, they allowed pain to complete its sentence. The room after midnight became a place of confession, though no one else was there to hear it. I hurt the one person who was trying to understand me. The words entered the silence. Then came another confession. I made them question their worth because I was afraid to face my own. And then the truth they had resisted the longest. I thought they would always stay. There it was. The hidden belief beneath every delay. They thought your love had no limit. They thought your loyalty meant you would continue returning no matter how little reassurance you received. They did not understand that even the most devoted heart can become exhausted from constantly proving it deserves care. They finally understood what they lost. Not ownership of you. Not control over your attention. They lost access to a version of you that had once trusted them deeply. And trust, once worn down, cannot be demanded back simply because regret has arrived. The truth was painful, but it was necessary. For the first time, their grief began to move beyond self-pity. They stopped asking only, why did they leave? They began asking, what did my actions make them feel while they were here? That question changed everything. It moved them from loss into accountability. They remembered the nights you waited for a response. The conversations where you felt alone even though two people were present. The times you minimized your own pain because theirs always seemed to take up more space. They imagined how exhausting it must have been to love someone who kept hiding behind confusion. And in that imagining, empathy finally entered the room. Your tears had once fallen where they could not see them. Now their tears fell because they finally saw. The balance was not revenge. It was awakening. Yet even then, the story did not become simple. A part of them wanted to contact you immediately. Their fingers hovered above the screen. They began typing. "I'm sorry." They stared at the words. They deleted them. Not because the apology was false, but because suddenly they understood how small it looked beside everything that needed to be acknowledged. They typed again. "I've been thinking about you." Deleted. Again. "I finally understand." Deleted. Each sentence sounded incomplete. How could a few words carry the weight of months of silence? How could they apologize without making the apology another burden for you to hold? How could they reach out without secretly expecting you to soothe the pain they had only just begun to face? This was the deeper test. Their tears had made them honest with themselves, but honesty with you required something more. It required humility. They could not arrive asking you to forget. They could not use their regret as a demand for access. They could not turn their emotional breakthrough into pressure for reconciliation. If they spoke, they would need to accept that you might not respond the way they hoped. That possibility frightened them. They placed the phone down again. For a few minutes, they walked through the quiet room. The rain had softened. The clock moved closer to morning. Then they noticed something near the edge of a shelf. An object connected to you, perhaps it was a small gift. A book. A folded note. A simple item that had survived every attempt to create distance. They picked it up. And another memory appeared. It was a moment from before everything became complicated. You had been laughing. They had watched you without realizing you noticed. You asked, "What?" They shook their head and said, "Nothing." But it had not been nothing. In that moment, they had felt peace. Real peace. A peace so unfamiliar that it scared them. They had wanted to tell you that being near you felt like coming home to a place they had never known existed. Instead, they stayed silent. That unsaid sentence returned now with unbearable clarity. They sank into a chair, holding the object close. The tears came again. These were different. The earlier tears carried regret. These carried grief for every beautiful feeling fear had prevented them from expressing. How many times had they loved you silently while acting indifferent? How many times had they wanted to reach for you but allowed pride to keep their hands still? How many moments had passed because they believed vulnerability would make them powerless? They finally saw that withholding love had not protected them. It had isolated them. Their defenses had worked, but not in the way they intended. They had kept pain out for a while. They had also kept intimacy out. They had built walls high enough to prevent abandonment, only to create the loneliness they feared. And you had stood outside those walls longer than anyone knew. You called gently. You waited patiently. You looked for doors. But you could not spend your entire life trying to enter a heart that refused to unlock itself. Your departure was not cruelty. It was the moment you stopped abandoning yourself. That truth became sacred. The spiritual lesson in this fictional journey is not that love must always remain. Sometimes love teaches through presence. Sometimes it teaches through distance. Sometimes the kindest thing a wounded person can do is stop participating in a cycle that diminishes both hearts. You may have wondered whether leaving made you cold. It did not. You may have wondered whether setting a boundary erased your compassion. It did not. You may have wondered whether choosing peace meant you never truly loved them. It did not. Sometimes love and distance exist in the same decision. You can care and still step away. You can forgive and still require change. You can understand someone's wounds without giving them permission to continue wounding you. This was what they began to comprehend while dawn approached. Your silence was not empty. It was full of lessons. It taught them that affection without responsibility is not enough. It taught them that good intentions do not erase repeated harm. It taught them that love should not require one person to become smaller so the other can remain comfortable. And most painfully, it taught them that a loyal heart can leave when loyalty is no longer honored. They had once believed your patience proved you would tolerate anything. Now they understood that your patience had been a gift, not a contract. The night moved toward morning. A faint gray light appeared beyond the window. The rain had almost stopped. They sat again, phone in hand. This time, they did not open your conversation. They opened a blank page. At first, they only stared. Then they began writing not a message to send, but a confession they needed to read themselves. I was afraid of being loved because being loved meant being seen. They paused. Then continued. I kept waiting for proof that you would hurt me, and while I waited, I became the one causing pain. Their breathing grew unsteady, but they kept writing. You were not asking me to save you. You were asking me to stand beside you. Another pause. I thought distance gave me control. I did not realize it was teaching you how to live without me. They covered their mouth as another sob escaped. No one had forced them to write those words. No friend had confronted them. No argument had cornered them. The truth arrived because they were finally tired of running from it. But then something unexpected happened. As they continued writing, the focus shifted. They stopped writing only about what they had lost. They began writing about you. Not as the person who left them. Not as the one whose absence caused their pain. But as a human being who had carried more than they deserved. They imagined your side of the story. They imagined the nights you questioned yourself. They imagined the courage it took to stop reaching out. They imagined the sadness beneath your calm. And for the first time, their regret became less about recovering the relationship and more about wishing they had protected your heart when it trusted them. That was the true turning point. Regret centered only on personal loss can still be selfish. But remorse that recognizes another person's pain can become the beginning of growth. They wrote. You deserved honesty before you had to ask for it. Then. You deserved consistency without proving you were worth it. And finally. You deserved to feel safe too. They stopped. The last sentence broke something open inside them. They had spent so much time thinking about their own need for safety that they had never considered yours. You were expected to understand their fear. You were expected to respect their distance. You were expected to remain calm through their uncertainty. But who had been protecting your emotional safety? Who had been reassuring you? Who had been holding space for your fear of being forgotten, rejected, or taken for granted? They knew the answer. Too often, no one. You had been trying to build a home in a place where you were still being treated like a visitor. They cried the tears they had hidden from everyone. Not quietly now. Not carefully. The room filled with the sound of a heart confronting itself. And somewhere in the symbolism of this story, a soft warmth seemed to enter the space not as proof of a supernatural event, but as an image of grace. Grace did not excuse what happened. Grace allowed truth to be faced without destruction. Grace whispered that accountability and self-hatred were not the same thing. They did not need to punish themselves forever. But they did need to become honest about the person they had been and the person they wanted to become. The tears were cleansing something. Not the consequences. Not the past. The denial. For months, denial had protected them from immediate pain. Now it was dissolving. They could finally see that losing your closeness was not a random tragedy that happened to them. Their choices had played a part. That realization was heavy, but it also returned something to them: responsibility. And responsibility, though uncomfortable, is where transformation begins. You cannot change what you refuse to name. You cannot repair what you continue to minimize. You cannot become emotionally safe while blaming everyone else for the walls you built. They understood. Yet the next question was harder. What should they do with that understanding? Should they contact you? Should they remain silent? Should they apologize even if no answer came? Should they begin changing privately before asking for another chance? The tears did not give them an easy answer. Emotional truth rarely arrives with a perfect instruction. They walked toward the window. The sky was beginning to lighten. Water moved slowly down the glass. The world outside had not changed, yet it appeared different because they were no longer seeing it through the same defenses. They thought of you waking somewhere else. Perhaps you were sleeping peacefully. Perhaps you were carrying your own questions. Perhaps you had already begun building a life that did not revolve around waiting. The thought hurt. But for the first time, they allowed your freedom to matter more than their comfort. Love is not only the desire to be chosen. Sometimes love is respecting another person's right to choose peace. They whispered your name. Not as a claim. As an apology. Then they returned to the table and looked at the message they had not sent. The screen still held the blank conversation. Their fingers hovered over the keyboard. 100 possible openings entered their mind. None felt sufficient. They did not want to manipulate you with their pain. They did not want to say they were crying as if tears automatically erased what had happened. They did not want to promise change before living it. They wanted, perhaps for the first time, to speak without hiding and without demanding. So they typed slowly. I don't know whether I have the right to say this, and I am not asking you to make me feel better. They stopped. Read it. Continued. I finally allowed myself to face what my silence cost you. Their hand trembled. I told myself I was confused, but much of the time I was afraid. You offered me honesty, and I answered with distance. You asked for presence, and I gave you uncertainty. The message grew longer. Not dramatic, not desperate. Honest. They acknowledged specific moments. They did not blame their past. They did not blame timing. They did not blame you for stepping away. They wrote the words they should have spoken before the distance became so wide. I cared more than I ever admitted. They stared at that sentence. It felt both freeing and devastating. Because admitting love after loss does not automatically restore what fear damaged. Still, the truth deserved to exist. They continued. You were not difficult to love. I was difficult to reach. Another tear fell onto the screen. They wiped it away. You did not ask for too much. I gave too little clarity and expected your patience to cover the difference. The room grew brighter. Morning was near. Then they reached the part that frightened them most. They needed to tell you what had triggered the tears. It was more than the old message. More than the photograph. More than the silence, there was a discovery. A hidden detail. Something they found while searching through the memories. They had opened an old voice recording. At first, they did not recognize it. The file had no meaningful title, only a date from a night they had almost forgotten. They pressed play. Your voice filled the room. Soft. Tired. Honest. It was not a message you had intended for them to hear. Perhaps it was a recording you accidentally sent and quickly deleted. Perhaps it had been saved somewhere before disappearing from the conversation. In the symbolic world of this fictional story, it represented the truth that sometimes survives even after people attempt to erase it. They listened. Your voice trembled. You were speaking to yourself, trying to gather the courage to say something you never managed to send. I don't think they know how much this is hurting me. They froze. The recording continued. I keep pretending I'm okay because I don't want them to feel pressured. I know they have their own pain. I know they're afraid. But I'm starting to disappear inside this. Their hand covered their mouth. The tears returned instantly. Your voice was not angry. That made it worse. You sounded exhausted. You spoke about loving them. You spoke about trying to remain patient. You spoke about the fear that one day there would be nothing left of your hope. Then you said something they would never forget. I wish they would choose me before I have to choose myself and walk away. The recording ended. Silence returned. But it was no longer the same silence. Those words entered every place they had tried to keep closed. You had warned them. Not with threats. With vulnerability. You had reached a point where love and self-respect were pulling you in opposite directions, and you had prayed they would make the choice easier. They did not. So eventually, you made it yourself. They replayed the recording. Once. Twice. A third time. Each repetition revealed another layer of your hidden pain. They finally heard the tears you had kept from them. And now their own tears answered yours across time. Heaven saw the moment their heart broke open not as a prediction or verified revelation, but as the central image of this story, one wounded heart finally understanding another. The message they had been writing now felt different. They could no longer make it only about their regret. They needed to honor what you had endured. They typed. I heard something tonight that showed me how alone you felt while trying to love me. Then stopped. How could they explain where the recording came from? How could they admit they had listened to words you never intended them to hear? Would telling you bring healing, or would it reopen a wound? They hesitated. The sun had begun to rise, casting a narrow band of light across the floor. For the first time all night, they noticed how much time had passed. Hours. Hours of crying, remembering, writing, deleting, confessing. Yet there was still one truth they had not faced. Why had they kept the recording? Why had it remained hidden among their files? They searched their memory. Then it came back. They had heard part of it once before. Not the whole thing. Only the beginning. On the night it was created, the file had appeared briefly. They had pressed play, heard the tremble in your voice, and stopped it after a few seconds. They knew it contained your pain. They knew listening would require them to respond. So they avoided it. They told themselves they would return later. But later became days. Days became distance. Distance became loss. This was why the tears became uncontrollable. They had not been completely unaware. A part of them had known you were breaking. They simply were not ready to face what your pain demanded from them. That was the hardest confession. Not, I did not know. But, I knew enough to look away. They lowered their head. The room filled with a grief deeper than longing. They were grieving the moment courage could have changed everything. They imagined what might have happened had they listened that night. Perhaps they would have called. Perhaps they would have finally told the truth. Perhaps they would have said, "I am afraid, but I do not want to lose you." Perhaps your story would have unfolded differently. But the past does not reopen because regret arrives. It can only be understood. And from that understanding, a different future self may be built. They cried until there were no performances left. No excuses. No defensive explanations. Only truth. The person everyone believed was strong had finally allowed themselves to become human. And somewhere beyond that quiet room, you were continuing your own journey. Perhaps you had no idea what was happening. Perhaps you never would. Your healing did not need to pause until someone else understood the pain they caused. That is important. Sometimes closure comes through conversation. Sometimes it comes through distance. Sometimes it comes from finally recognizing that another person's inability to value you correctly was never an accurate measurement of your worth. You are not forgotten because someone failed to choose you well. You are not unlovable because someone's fear made them inconsistent. You are not foolish because you believed in what the connection could become. You loved from the level of awareness you had then. Now you are learning to love without abandoning yourself. That growth is not a betrayal of your heart. It is the protection your heart always deserved. Still, the story in the quiet room continued. The message remained unsent. They read it from the beginning. It was honest. It was accountable. It contained no demand. Yet something was missing. They had explained their regret. They had acknowledged your pain. They had admitted their fear. But they had not told you what they planned to do differently. Words of remorse can be meaningful, but change becomes visible through action. They erased the final paragraph. Then began again. I am not asking you to return to a place that hurt you. They paused. I am not asking you to trust words I have not yet earned. Their breathing steadied. I only want to tell you the truth I should have told you before. Your love mattered. Your patience mattered. Your leaving forced me to face what your staying could not. They read the sentence slowly. It hurt, but it was honest. Some people only hear a lesson after the teacher is gone. They continued. I am going to work on the parts of me that use distance as protection. Not as a promise to win you back, but because I do not want fear to keep hurting the people I care about. For the first time, the message felt complete. Almost. There was still the recording. Should they mention it? Their finger hovered. They opened the file again. Before pressing play, they noticed something they had missed. The recording was longer than they realized. There were several seconds of silence after the sentence about choosing yourself. They had assumed it ended there. But the timeline showed more. A final portion remained. Their heart began to pound. They pressed play. At first, only your breathing could be heard. Then your voice returned, quieter than before. There is something I haven't told them. They sat completely still. The light from the window moved across the table. Your voice trembled as if you were deciding whether to continue. I was going to tell them the next time we spoke, but now I don't know if that moment will ever come. They leaned closer to the phone. Every tear stopped. Every thought became silent. The final words were there, waiting inside a recording they had avoided for far too long. And just before your hidden confession began, they heard you whisper, "The real reason I stayed was because."